My son said, "We used your savings for our honeymoon. You don't need that much anyway." The sentence landed like a stone into a quiet pond. For a moment, the surface trembled and the ripples kept going, through the china cabinet, past the framed photographs on the mantel, into the small coterie of geraniums I tended on the back stoop. I remember the cup in my hand cooling against my palm, the radio in the kitchen talking about the weather as if nothing had shifted. Brian's face was carefully calm, as if he had rehearsed the line, as if he were even now doing me a favor by saying what he thought I needed to hear. My hands tightened around the cup until a hairline crack ran across the saucer. I did not shout. I put the cup down, walked to the window, and watched the hydrangeas. They were the same color they had been the summer Tom died, deep blue gone purple in the hot weather, and for a heartbeat I was simply a woman remembering where she had put the photographs 5 years earlier. Then I looked at my son. I had raised him. I had ironed his shirts the night before his first interview, wiped his fevered brow at 3 a.m., stayed up until the airport called with flights, and missed school plays to sit through his recitals. I had been here, in this house, for 37 years. Tom and I had painted these walls together, fixed the loose stair banister ourselves, argued about the mailbox pole, and planted the apple tree that never quite bore well. When Tom died, I learned how to do the mortgage paperwork and how to pay the plumber. I learned how to be alone and still not lonely, book club on Thursdays, a volunteer shift at the library, supper with Helen and Clara on alternate Sundays. Independence was not a fragile thing. It was a muscle I had built by degrees. So when Brian said it, when he pronounced my life disposable because he needed plane tickets and a resort, the betrayal burned, but it did not flatten me. There was shock, yes. There was a sharp, sorrowful ache for the son who had once climbed my apple tree and fallen asleep on the lawn. But there was also a steadiness that surprised him. He had expected, I could tell by the way his eyes flicked to my hands, a different reaction. He had rehearsed cajoling, urgency, the soft-voiced, "we're just trying to help" line. He had not planned for quiet. After that first slow, brittle minute, I said only what I needed to say. You and Tiffany can gather your things and leave the house if you're done living here, but you cannot take the house with you. You know how the property is titled. He blinked. Tiffany's smile tightened. There was a nervous flutter in her fingers that belied the Pinterest-perfect veneer she kept. "Mom," she said, as if she were stepping into a scene where she had already relearned the role of kind interlocutor, "we just want what's best for you."
He had a plane to catch. "We want to finalize the sale today," he said, as if the world were a place where houses were like sweaters one traded in the morning. He had hired movers, he told me. They would be here in an hour to take the big pieces. That 1 hour changed the way I thought of sunlight in this kitchen. I made myself a list, in my head, of what to do. I had a trust. That fact felt suddenly luminous and practical, the hinge on which everything turned. I had insisted on a living trust years ago, because Tom wanted the house to pass smoothly when we were gone, and because I did not want another year in probate. I had signed papers then, with a notary in the lawyer's small office, and I had never thought my own son would try to treat those papers like scrap. The trust named me trustee. It named Tom's sister as successor. I had never believed the house could be stripped from me with a smile and a suitcase. I called the county clerk myself. I waited on hold long enough to have the time to remember my father calling me to mow the lawn when I was 10. "Yes," the clerk said, when I gave the parcel number I had learned to say over the years. "The property is held in the Sanderson Family Living Trust. Margaret Sanderson is listed as trustee." I had expected relief to feel like a shot of hot tea. Instead, it felt like the first cool breath after holding one's breath for too long. I thanked the clerk, told him not to worry, and put the phone in my apron pocket. I called Sarah. She was there within an hour, as she always had been in small crises, a longtime friend who had become a lawyer in her 40s and who still hated the word retirement. Sarah arrived smelling faintly of lemon oil and a purse full of practical pens. When she hugged me, she did not ask 100 questions. She asked one that let me choose the telling. "Do you want me to come in?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Driving back toward the house, Sarah took me through, in plain terms and with no glare, what the trust meant. "As trustee," she said, "you have authority to decide what happens to trust property. That's what makes this, what they're attempting, illegal, in the sense that no honest dealer would touch it." She did not promise thunderbolt remedies. She did not promise to erase the shock or to fix the betrayal. She kept her mouth small and clear, as if she were outlining the bones of a plan rather than the weather. When Sarah came through the front door, she examined the mantel and the row of books as if they were evidence not of age or sentimentality, but of a life lived deliberately. She asked me softly to sit, and she sat across from me as if we were two people on the same line of a map. We went slowly through the practical things first. Trust papers, deeds, the latest bank statement, the names on the mortgage. The house had matured some years before, no mortgage left. The paperwork for Tom's pension.
She wanted a contemporaneous list of witnesses, people who had seen Brian talk about selling the house, who had seen the movers' calls, who might testify to my state of mind and competence if need be. Competence, she said, and the word hit the table like a plain coin on a wooden slab. There are times a lawyer's vocabulary simplifies and keeps you honest. This was one. They may try to paint you as incapable, Margaret, she said. If someone is going to take the house, they will attempt to show you shouldn't be making decisions. I told Sarah about Dr. Patricia Henshaw, who had been here the week before. Henshaw had been polite, professional, and, now that I think back, too quick to accept Tiffany's account of my forgetfulness. She had taken notes, asked standard questions, and then, with a smile that read expertise, suggested a full evaluation might be a good idea, just to rule things out. In retrospect, the visit felt like a staged rehearsal. In the moment, it felt like care. I had let the visit sit on my shelf like the cards from children at Christmas. "You didn't sign anything?" Sarah asked. "No," I said. "Just tea and a brochure." "Good." Sarah's lips made a small circle. "That will matter." By the time the mover's van was supposed to arrive, I had a neat stack of papers: the trust document, a photocopy of the deed, a notation of who the successor trustees were, a few recent bank statements showing the savings I had set aside for emergencies, and the names of some neighbors who had seen Brian's truck idling in the driveway the day before. I also had Sarah. We did not have a warrant or a badge or a medieval posse. We had temperate words and the legal fact of the trust. I made tea we did not drink. When the movers pulled into the curb, their van looked ordinary, white with a name on the side I had never noticed before. There were two men in uniform, heavy canvas moving blankets draped over their shoulders, and a clipboard tucked under one arm. Brian met them on the porch with the kind of calm you reserve for closing arguments. He had on a sweater and a watch he hardly ever wore as a kid. Tiffany was behind him, a bright, anxious flourish beside his composed lines. Sarah stepped forward. She carried her bag as if it were a shield, and her voice was the steady tool I had seen used before, precise, neither loud nor soft. She introduced herself to the men by name and asked to see their work order. One man flipped the clipboard open with the practiced motion of someone who had the day already mapped and explained, "We have a pickup scheduled for 10 a.m. with the client listed as Brian Sanderson." "Yes," Sarah said, without indignation. "Do you have authorization to remove trust property from the Sanderson Family Living Trust, signed and notarized by the trustee, or a court order?" There was a pause. The men looked at each other. One tapped the form. "Client says it's all set." "We require written authorization," Sarah said.
"We also require verification of title in disputes like this. The trustee present is Margaret Sanderson. I represent her." There is a peculiar energy in a porch confrontation that is neither performance nor fight, but a negotiation about who will be allowed to reshape a life's physical landscape. In some ways it looked petty, a clipboard here, a flattened cardboard box there, but in other ways it felt elemental. Brian tried a soft persuasion, the voice his father used when coaxing Tom's stubbornness out of the garage door. "Mom, we're only trying to help. Think of us. You won't have to worry about taxes or upkeep. You can move into a place that's easier." "You mean a place that is smaller and has worse light," I said. There was an ache in my throat I did not let show. "This is my home. The trust protects it." Tiffany stepped forward with the sweet, practiced concern of someone who had learned to make compassion look like persuasion. "It's not about taking away your independence, Margaret," she said. "It's about freeing you from burden." I wanted to list the burdens I had managed for years, to tell them about standing on a ladder repainting the porch eaves at 62 because Tom had trusted me with the brush. I kept my voice even. I told them, "If you have legal proof, show it. If you don't, then I ask you to respect the trust document." At that, one of the movers, young with a paint-smudged wristband, stepped backward. He did not want more argument. He wanted his paycheck and the sense that he worked for people who paid him and gave him clear orders. His partner shrugged and looked to the van. Sarah asked me to sign a document acknowledging the items and noting who was present. I did. Everything in that moment felt best rendered in ink and polite formality. I could see in the corner of my eye the camera from the neighbor's porch clicking. Clara had come out and had a phone aimed, steady and witness-like. The movers, after a few uncomfortable minutes, leaned against the truck and put their heads together. The foreman, broad with a tired face, looked at his clipboard and at Sarah. He said in a voice that had washed out more fights than he could count, "If there's a legal order, I'll follow it. If not, I can't take responsibility."
He suggested they call their manager. There was a pause while someone in a back office decided whether a job was worth a lawsuit. Brian's jaw tightened. I could see him calculating time like a board on which he could place his next move. The porch seemed to shrink. The garden felt suddenly too small to hold the conversation. Tiffany's lips trembled now, her practiced sweetness replaced by something sharper. The movers left with the van idle and their hands empty. One of them apologized to Sarah for the trouble and promised to have their manager call. As they drove away, the sound of diesel left a faint film of exhaust over the driveway. It should have been a clean stop.
In a different story, that would have been the end. One attempted theft, one cool lawyer, and the status quo restored. But people with an agenda seldom accept a setback as final. That afternoon, I did what I had always done when storms gathered. I began to gather facts. It felt natural to me. I had always trusted documents. Paper tells a story in ways words sometimes do not. I photocopied the trust and the deed, made notes of times and dates, and wrote down who had seen what. I asked Helen to write down what she had witnessed, how Brian had been talking about helping me get rid of things for months. She wrote neatly in the block letter she kept for checks. I called the bank. I asked for copies of recent statements for the account linked to emergency savings, things I had kept for so long against hiccups and cold nights. I asked, because Sarah suggested it indirectly and because it felt right, for copies of the recent travel transactions. The teller on the line asked for security questions. I answered them without thinking of anything but Tom teaching me how to play chess across a small oak table. When the records came, there were lines to read, numbers, dates, and the occasional vendor. There was a charge that stunned me, one to an upscale travel company with a line item that read in crisp type, Resort Booking, Maldives. There were other charges that, when I called the credit company and asked for details, matched hotels and flights. Some of this could have been innocent. Perhaps it was a business trip. Perhaps it was a mistake. People make mistakes when they type numbers, I told myself. But when Robert Chen, a colleague of Brian's whom I had known in passing at a PTA meeting years ago, called, reluctant, a little ragged, he told me that Brian had been nervous at work, stumbling over projects, sometimes offhandedly mentioning money troubles. He seemed not himself, Robert said. He did not want to be involved, but he had seen a social media post that Tiffany had made, pictures of a white sand beach and a turquoise ocean. He had the dates. He sent screen captures. Seeing the images did something that facts do not always do. It turned numbers into a narrative. There they were, Tiffany on a beach, hair windblown and laughing, Brian leaning back with his head thrown, sunglasses on, a cocktail with an umbrella in the sand. I remember the precise sting of indignation, less at the beaches than at the audacity that the images were posted like a postcard bragging in the face of a house whose rooms had been claimed like ransom. I made a list of what I now had: trust document, confirmation of title from the county clerk, recent bank and credit card statements with a travel charge, social media posts that placed Brian and Tiffany in the Maldives at dates overlapping with suspicious charges, and witness statements from neighbors and friends who had seen the movers van or overheard conversations. I put each piece in an envelope and labeled them like a careful housekeeper would label jars in a pantry. Each label felt like I was giving voice to the possibility of a problem. Sarah and I met that evening at the kitchen table. She moved a coaster and a stack of mail with the same economy of motion she used in the courtroom. She looked at the documents and said, "This is more than suspicion. It's a pattern." She did not say that they had committed a crime. She did not say what she could not know. She said only what her eyes read plainly. "This is actionable in my experience." My experience became a safe phrase for me, containing hope without promising absolutes. She advised that we document everything, to get copies of the mover's work order if possible, to ask neighbors for footage, and to make a contemporaneous log of every interaction. She suggested that we might need to be ready for a legal counterattack, petitioning for guardianship, a claim of incompetence. But she couched everything as what had occurred in other stories she had seen, in some cases, in some situations. I liked that. It felt honest. The next morning, the moving company called. The manager wanted to be clear that he was acting on a claim by a named client. I asked for the work order. He read me the name and the address and told me their crew had been on site. Their foreman had talked to Brian and was following what had been described as client authorization. I asked for documentation. He promised to fax a copy. When the fax arrived, a thin sheet printed the company's logo and the words service order. It showed pickup address and the client's contact. There was a line to sign. It appeared to be signed by an individual who, on closer inspection, had used a shaky hand. Whether that was Brian's signature or not, I could not say for certain,
but the presence of the order and the timing now framed their intent. I made a call to the county's property records office again to ask whether a sale had been recorded. It had not. There was no transfer of title. The trust, as the clerk confirmed with a gentle economy that became familiar to me, still stood. There is a strange kind of grief in discovering that someone you love has decided to take you as collateral for their desires. It is not the same grief as the sudden loss of a person in a car crash or a long death that quietly comes. It is a grief that contains disbelief and embarrassment and the sense of exposure, like standing at the window without a curtain. I thought of the times I had let Brian borrow a few dollars for gas or supported him while he had finished courses in an uncertain economy. I thought of the sacrifices that are in a family not ledgered in numbers but in years, late night sewing costumes, driving to soccer in the rain, standing in a hospital corridor. Who places those years on a balance sheet?
The answer was crashing up against me. Sometimes the people who benefit from those years believe they entitle them. That night, alone in the kitchen with the lamps on and the house breathing like an old friend, I wrote in my journal. I wrote about Tom's small habits, the way he liked his socks folded, the place he would set his hat, and I wrote about the apple tree and the time Brian had built a fort in the den with old blanket forts and a flashlight on top that made him feel like a pirate. I wanted to remember that the house was a collection of stories, not a commodity. Paper cannot capture the smell of Sunday frying onions or the way the light falls on the stair rail at 3 in the afternoon, but it can keep dates and names. So I cataloged what I knew. In the days that followed, there were a dozen small invasions. A voicemail from an unknown clinic asking about a memory screening, a neighbor mentioning that Brian had told the garden club he was helping his mother downsize, and an offhand remark from a woman at the market who said, "Isn't it difficult for older people to manage property these days?" I felt a pressure building, as if someone were tightening a band I could not locate. The pressure was not only legal, it was social. There is a soft form of theft that passes through courtrooms and through dinner conversations alike. When their first direct push stalled, they did not retreat. They regrouped. One afternoon, a man I had never met walked to my front door and asked to speak with me about my care plan. He introduced himself politely as a caseworker, Linda Martinez, he said, working through a local services program I had never heard of. He said that he was concerned for my safety and that someone had suggested I might benefit from a full evaluation. He asked if I had someone to handle my finances. I told him the truth. I managed my checks. I paid the house insurance. I had a savings account. I was trustee of my trust. Linda took notes thoughtfully and asked whether I would consent to a visit from someone who could assess mobility and memory. I told him I appreciated the offer, but that I was not interested at the moment. He left his card. I had a sinking sense in those days of a small, coordinated theater. Calls, polite visitors, notes from clinics, and the occasional hint that someone, somewhere, had told a story about me that made me seem less able to make choices. When the story you believe about yourself is contradicted by the external narrative others choose to tell, you feel the ground shift under you. I also felt something else simultaneously, the sturdy network of people who resisted this rewriting. Clara and Helen sharpened their testimonies into crisp statements about what they had witnessed, Brian's repeated insistence on helping, and the moving truck idling too long in the driveway. My book club, Patricia, Linda, and a few others, began to organize on my behalf in small, quiet ways. They offered to bring over meals, to put together lists of anyone who could testify to my daily competence. They did not parade me. They wanted to document continuity. My attendance at the library volunteer group, my role leading a monthly reading circle. These were not grand gestures. They were ordinary life. They offered to bring over meals, to put together lists of anyone who could testify to my daily competence. They did not parade me. They wanted to document continuity. My attendance at the library volunteer group, my role leading a monthly reading circle. These were not grand gestures. They were ordinary life, offered as proof of a life lived. I met with Sarah again, and we discussed the possibility that Brian might take a more formal route, a guardianship petition. She explained in plain terms what that was in the abstract, a request to a court to appoint someone to make decisions for another person,
but always with the reminder that in this case, we were talking about her interpretation as a lawyer, and that the court's eventual judgment could vary. I liked that frankness. I had seen too many legal dramas on television and in the papers to trust certainty. I learned to prefer, in this case, to promises. It was Sarah who suggested that we secure as much contemporaneous documentation as possible, retain copies of social media posts, request the mover's paperwork formally, ask the bank for specific transactions, and contact neighbors to see if they had footage of the truck. It felt in a way like making a quilt, small, stubborn pieces stitched together to make something protective. There were practicalities, too. Locks to change? No, Sarah said, unless I wanted to escalate. Security cameras? She recommended we document what we had first. She emphasized that the philosophy here was not to barricade myself like an embattled monarch, but to prepare defensively and legally. It was a delicate balance, like tending the hydrangeas. Water enough, not too much. I do not spend days inventing drama. I spend days whose details are the sort of thing that build lives, watering plants, answering neighborly queries, making tea. The next move by Brian and Tiffany was both petty and ruthless. They arranged for a physician, Dr. Patricia Henshaw, the same physician who had visited earlier, to produce an assessment that, without overt alarm, suggested a need for further evaluation. The next morning, a short typed report arrived in the mail. Neutral language about concerns, a line about decreased short-term recall, and an appendant suggestion that someone coordinate care. The report was not a verdict. It was a document that, in the hands of someone intent on making a case, could be turned into a tool. When Sarah read it, she folded her hands and said quietly, "We will address this. We will get your medical records, and we will ask for additional opinions if needed. For now, this is a single note. It cannot and should not be read in isolation." There are many ways to break a person down. Some are big and theatrical, others are small and bureaucratic. I felt as if I were caught between the two, the big swing of a moving truck at the curb and the small scratch of a typed doctor's note. Both were, in their own ways, attempts to take something that belonged to me.
At the same time, the community's support became a visible force. The library offered to host a small meeting about elder rights. Helen and Clara went through legal checklists with Sarah, bridging the gap between the technical and the ordinary. David, someone from Tom's Bridge group, nervously stepping into an auxiliary role, offered to help with small repairs around the house so there would be no excuse for neglect. These gestures mattered, not because they were dramatic, but because they established a consistent record, one I intended to show should it be necessary. There was one evening, after a week of small escalations, when Brian sat on my living room sofa with a thin, almost apologetic smile and said, "We'll file the paperwork tomorrow," as if it were the next task on a trip itinerary. He spoke about it like a necessary business step, the same way some people speak about replacing a roof. I felt the memory of the night he was born, how I had held him and thought he was the whole world, press against the present like two mismatched frames. Grief and anger can exist at once. I felt them both. When he left that evening, he left with a hardness in his step that had not been there the week before. I thought then, with a woman's quiet certainty, that people who are willing to cross a line like this once will consider crossing it again. The way the tide returns to a shore is not always visible in the first wave. You watch for the pattern. Up until that point, I had been careful not to make assumptions. I had been careful to separate what I knew, facts, documents, images, from what I feared. But as the days moved into one another, fear became methodical. I checked the door locks. I counted the inventory of my jewelry. I made copies of the trust and gave them to Sarah. I walked around my house and memorized the small things, the way a person might memorize the shape of a coastline. Then came the day a man in a suit I did not know came to my kitchen table and sat down as if he had a right to be there. He introduced himself with the calm of a professional and asked a few questions that felt entirely ordinary, about bills, about whether I had someone authorized to handle my finances, about whether I had noticed any lapses in memory. He carried a clipboard. He thanked me and then left an impression on the mantel like a small stone. When they want to take something, they often try to establish you as incapable of deciding, Sarah said later. They will collect anything that can be read as evidence. That is why we have to be both methodical and public in our documentation. Methodical I could be. Public was the harder part. Pride has a way of asking for privacy.
Dignity sometimes asks us to remain silent, but I had no intention of becoming the type of story told behind closed doors. The next morning, the county clerk left a message on my phone. Someone had inquired about a transfer possibility. I returned the call and asked who had asked.
The clerk could not disclose it, but noted I had called recently and assured me that no transfer had been recorded. It was not a triumph. It was a line drawn in administrative ink. The real turning point, for me, was not the papers or the charges or even the movers. It was a small, private moment when Helen knocked on my door, walked in, and sat down beside my favorite armchair without looking at the papers on the table. She made tea, as she always did, and she said simply, "We will keep coming." That sentence was a kind of armor. It was solidarity. It suggested that the people I had chosen as my circle, book club, neighbors, friends, would not allow me to be recast by a narrative that suited someone else's needs. When the movers came back 3 days later, this time with a different foreman and a neatly printed authorization, the foreman had a polite, careful expression and a scanner in his hand. Brian stood rigid as a rod, Tiffany beside him with a face composed of practiced worry. Sarah arrived 10 minutes before the men knocked on the door. She had called ahead. This time there was a different choreography. The mover scanned the authorization and then asked to see proof. The foreman's eyes flicked to Sarah. The foreman's scanner, to him, was a machine that limited liability. Sarah handed him a copy of the trust and the deed and explained that the trustee had not authorized any removal of property. She did not shout. She did not smear accusations across the driveway. She simply put papers in his hands and offered him the chance to do the right thing. He looked at the forms, back at the signature, and at the client. "I can't take anything without written and notarized direction from the trustee or a court order," he said. Brian's face changed in a way I knew too well, the twitch of a man who had always expected the world to yield to his sense of entitlement. He reached toward the clipboard as if to snatch authority back. Tiffany put a hand on his arm as if to calm him. The foreman closed the clipboard and told them they would leave. There was a sound that I will not easily forget, the soft, drained exhale from Tiffany, the creak of the van door, the long, measured turn of the engine as it pulled away. In the absence of violence, the van's departing seemed louder because it signaled a retreat, not a surrender. People who plan this sort of thing rarely accept a single denial. Sarah sat down then on the stoop and took both my hands. "They may escalate," she said. "They could ask for a legal determination of your capacity. They could file a guardianship petition. They might attempt to secure an evaluation that frames you as incapable. In some cases, these battles end in court." "I know," I said. My voice was small, not because of fear, but because of the weight of years. "I know what they will try. I will file a notice of objection if they move forward," she said. "We will put together the medical records you have, collect witness statements, get copies of their transactions and postings. We will show continuity." That night, I lay awake thinking of continuity, of the stitchwork of ordinary days, and I thought of the long legal words that can be used to unmoor a life. I wondered how easily a governor of a life might be replaced by someone who once slept in the same house. There is a thinness to the days that follow a porch confrontation. The world is both the same and not the same. I found myself checking my mail more carefully, recording the time of every unexpected knock. I kept a small ledger of calls, who came by and what they had said. I asked Helen to take photographs of my living room, skewed the way it actually was, no staged photography, and to write a note about the last time she had seen me at the library. For all the careful record-keeping, there was a deeper, quieter change taking hold. Having my papers in order had always given me a sense of freedom. Now they were my defense. I learned to find a kind of calm in sorting things, stapling, arranging, writing dates in the margins. I treated it like prayer, except that instead of speaking into the dark, I was bringing light to the surface of what could be proven. It felt often like working in reverse. Where others tried to create a narrative of incapacity, I sought evidence of ordinary capacity. I called my doctor, asked whether my chart would show regular visits, and had the receptionist mark the files. I asked the library to note my volunteer hours. I had the bank clerk sign a small note that she had seen me in person to request copies. Each small stamp of witness reinforced the story I wanted to tell, the story that I had been, and still was, the steward of my life. Yet even as I built this scaffolding of proofs, there was a moral ache that would not be quieted by documents.
The pain of betrayal came not from the taking itself, but from the intimacy of the takers. A child takes when a stranger can be rebuked by a glance. A child takes with the advantage of a history of trust. That was the real wound, and it ached beneath my sternum like a bruise. Then, one evening, after a day of clipped calls and formalities, I found a note tucked under my front door. It was not signed. It read only in a tidy female hand. "We can make this easy, Margaret. Think of your peace." The handwriting could have been Tiffany's. It could have been a neighbor's. It could have been the wind. But words placed where a householder sees them are not wind. They are intentional. I put the note into the pocket of my coat and sat at the table. The lamp threw a circle of light across the trust document and the stack of bank copies. I poured a glass of water and leaned my head against the chair back and thought of Tom calling me from the garage because the engine would not start. The way he would smile at me as if we were conspirators against the world's small difficulties.
I thought of that crooked smile and of the apple tree that still refuses to give the best fruit. If this is speaking to you, please tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. I would like to know the line that connects us. Cities, towns, counties, neighborhoods. Each of us has a porch, a mantle, a chair, where we keep our memories. I want to know who is on my side of the world. After that, the rhythms changed faster. There was a voicemail from an assistant who said, "We would like to schedule an evaluation." An email arrived with a scanned form. The sender's name matched a law office that, to my surprise, had a picture of a young lawyer wearing a shiny tie. Brian was not one to be subtle. He had learned, it seemed, how to mobilize the formal machinery of concern. But even as they arranged evaluations and forms and visits, my allies multiplied in small, practical ways. Patricia from the book club started a petition to the local community services. A neighbor, David, Tom's bridge companion, offered to come every afternoon for tea. He was clumsy in gestures, but present in the way that matters. He showed up. The presence of ordinary people made it harder for formalities to write the story they wanted. Community is a kind of witness. It is a soft, accumulated proof that a life is lived. On a bright Tuesday, a week after the first mover's van, a package arrived for me in the mail. On a bright Tuesday, a week after the first mover's van, a package arrived for me in the mail. It was ordinary at first glance, a thin, official-looking envelope with a local law firm return address, and beneath it, my name in crisp type. The weight of paper has a way of making ordinary days into pivot points. I sat at the kitchen table and slid a finger under the flap, as if a single motion could keep everything orderly. Inside was a formal petition, a guardianship. The words were precise and spare, no fireworks. A petition to adjudge me incapable of managing my personal and financial affairs, and to appoint a guardian to act on my behalf. It named Brian as the proposed guardian. It included an affidavit from a physician, Dr. Patricia Henshaw, referencing concerns about short-term memory and instances of confusion noted by family. There was also a notice setting a hearing date. I folded the paper and set it beside the trust. The two documents lay on the table like different languages describing the same person. I had known this step was possible. Sarah had warned me they might escalate to formal filings. Still, seeing the petition felt like a winter wind arriving in a summer window. Sarah arrived within the hour. There are crises that announce themselves with sirens, and crises that unroll quietly with envelopes. She sat down at the table, read the papers without astonishment, and then put them down as if she were placing a calm hand on a restless animal. "This is what we prepared for, in the sense that it's a known play," she said.
"It's invasive, but it's a defined process. We'll respond by showing that you are capable and that this petition is not supported by the evidence." She spoke with the practical clarity I had learned to trust. We went through the petition line by line. Sarah explained that in a guardianship hearing, the court would consider medical evidence, witness testimony, and any documents that showed a pattern of incapacity. The petition would present the narrative that I could not manage my affairs. Our task was to show continuity, my ongoing activities, my volunteering, my handling of finances, and that the trust was in good order. She said we should prepare witnesses, request records, and assemble the contemporaneous documents we had already been collecting. Preparation took on the shape of small, insistent rituals. I made lists with shaded boxes next to each name: Helen, Clara, Patricia, David, the bank teller whose name I now knew, Robert Chen, the movers foreman. I called each person and asked, simply, "Will you come to court if needed?" The replies were steady and immediate. "Of course, tell me when." They were not dramatic promises. They were the kind of ordinary loyalty one accumulates over decades. Sarah subpoenaed documents: the mover's work order, the travel company's invoice, bank records linked to the travel charge, and the social media posts we had saved. She filed for the medical records from my primary care physician and requested the notes Dr. Henshaw had produced. She instructed me to keep my ledger of activities current and asked me to write a short affidavit about my daily routine, what I did in a typical week, who I saw, how I paid bills. Her language was precise. "We are not prosecuting spitefully," she said. "We are presenting a record, continuity, competence, and the fact that the trust remains controlling the home." There were, alongside the logistical work, small emotional tasks. I sat in the den and went through the photographs on the mantel, touching edges and straightening frames, as if that could make a timeline legible for someone else. I wrote down the dates when I'd chaired the library fundraiser, the evenings I'd led the reading circle, the volunteer appreciation certificate tucked in the drawer. I asked the library to print a log of my volunteer hours. They did so with a cheerful efficiency that felt like a small blade in the DAC. We worked to depersonalize the evidence in the best possible way. Instead of appealing to sentiment, Sarah insisted on the concrete: calendars showing appointments, records of transactions I had made, the trust document, and witness statements from people who had seen me perform the routines of daily life. The goal was to show that I had not slipped into the sort of chronic forgetfulness the petition suggested. The court responds to patterns more than to one-off impressions. When discovery returned Dr.
Henshaw's notes, they were measured and clinical: a brief visit, some observations, a suggestion for further evaluation. The notes themselves were not a death knell. They were a prompt. Sarah arranged for a second opinion, an independent geriatric specialist with a reputation for careful, thorough cognitive evaluations, someone who would speak plainly about the results. In my case, the second specialist cognitive assessment showed results consistent with normal age-related changes and no evidence of significant impairment that would justify removal of decision-making authority. That evaluation would prove crucial. The paperwork was heavy. My kitchen table looked for a moment like a small courthouse. Envelopes, subpoenas, medical releases. I signed my name on forms until it felt mechanical and steady. It helped to keep my hands busy. It helped me remember that agency is, in part, the ability to act, even when the world tries to take agency away. The hearing was scheduled for a brisk morning. A winter light lay on the courthouse steps. The building smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper. Sarah and I arrived early. Outside, a few friends from the book club, Helen and Clara, stood together, holding their coats closed against a cold wind. David had smoothed a tie he hardly wore anymore, and kept his hands folded in front of him like someone preparing to offer tea. People I had known for years took their place in the little audience section like a garden taking root. Courtrooms have a particular geometry of power and verbal economy. The judge, Judge Patricia Carmichael, who had presided over other local matters with a reputation for clear, no-nonsense rulings, sat behind a bench that looked as if it had been polished by argument. The room smelled of lemon polish and admonition. The petitioner's counsel, young, efficient, and brisk, presented the petition with a concise tone, highlighting the visit by Dr. Henshaw and some cousin's concerns. He spoke in a tone meant to suggest firmness without malice. Sarah stood and spoke with the steadiness of someone trained to translate life into record. She began with facts: the trust document, the clerk's confirmation that the property remained held by the trust, the lack of any recorded transfer. She then introduced witness affidavits, neighbors who had seen the moving van, the library's records of my volunteer hours, the bank statements showing that I continued to handle my own account. She presented the invoice and the credit card transactions that matched the social media postings, evidence of Brian and Tiffany's vacation funded by funds from an account they had access to or had charged. She called the mover's foreman as a witness. He testified that he had been presented with client authorization, but had ultimately refused to remove property without proof of trustee authorization. His measured account was simple: paper Myers. Then came Dr. Henshaw.
She appeared in the courtroom with a professional quietness, a small folder beneath her arm. She testified to her visit and to her clinical impressions, observations of intermittent confusion, and suggestions for further testing. The petitioner's counsel leaned on her, suggesting that her note was the basis for concern. Sarah did not attack Dr. Henshaw personally. Instead, she drew out context: who had requested the visit, the fact that the questions had come in the wake of familial tension, and that the visit had been brief and not sufficient alone to establish incapacity. Sarah introduced the independent geriatric specialist report into evidence. The specialist had conducted a standard cognitive battery, conversation history, and review of my medications. His conclusion, in plain language, was that while I showed normal age-related memory changes, I was capable of making reasoned decisions about my residence and finances. The specialist's calm testimony that he had seen no evidence of dementia sufficient to impair financial decisions calibrated the medical debate away from alarm to clarity.
There was a moment in the hearing that felt like a hinge. The petitioner's counsel, in a tone that could have sunlit an argument, urged that concern for an elder's safety is always paramount, and that appointing a guardian is a protective measure. He spoke about duty and about the difficulty families have in knowing when to intervene. I felt the ache of that idea deeply. It is hard to separate well-intentioned worry from manipulation. But Sarah's response was precise. Protection without evidence can itself be a form of harm. She argued that the trust already provided legal protections, and that to appoint a guardian would be to override the document I had signed intentionally years earlier. She insisted that the court should not replace an elder's choices with a better-intentioned child's choices, with clear, compelling evidence. The courtroom listened. Evidence, clear and contemporaneous, carries weight. Sarah's closing argument did not aim for theatrical flourish. It aimed for clarity. The trust, the continuity of my daily life, the medical evaluations showing competence, and the pattern of conduct by the petitioners, contradicted by their social media postings and travel charges, presented a narrative not of protection but of exploitation. She asked the court to consider whether a guardianship would be an appropriate response to a family disagreement, or whether it would be an instrument in the hands of someone seeking to control property. Judge Carmichael took notes in a particular shorthand. She read the exhibits, listened to testimony, and asked pointed questions of the experts. Her questions felt less like cross-examination than like a weighing of scales. What is the least restrictive alternative, she asked at one point, a legal phrase that resonated with the principle most protective of autonomy.
She returned again and again to the trust, who had signed it, when, and why. The idea that I had chosen deliberately to place the house in a living trust as a means of avoiding probate and keeping direction over my property sat with the bench as a fact that could not be ignored. When the ruling came, it was as precise as the petition had been. Judge Carmichael denied the guardianship petition. She noted on the record that the petitioner had not met the burden of showing that I lacked capacity to make financial and personal decisions. She ordered that legal fees be assessed against the petitioners in part, an unusual admonition that served as a formal recognition of the misuse of guardianship as a tool in this instance. She also made a referrals notation. She referred the matter to Adult Protective Services for investigation of potential financial exploitation and elder abuse. When the words left the judge's mouth, I felt something like a long-held breath released. Relief was a complicated thing. It arrived with gratitude and with sorrow. The judge's ruling did not erase the betrayal, nor did it make the family losses less. But it drew a line, a legal acknowledgement that the petition had been an appropriate instrument given the evidence. Outside the courtroom, Helen and Clara hugged me so hard for a moment I could feel the thread of both of our lives tighten. David, awkward and loyal, shuffled his feet and offered a small, dignified smile. Robert Chen, who had come to sit in the second row with an expression of quiet resolve, patted my shoulder and said simply, "I'm glad you kept the receipts." The referral to Adult Protective Services began a separate administrative track. APS workers met with me, with Sarah present, and examined the financial records, the credit card statements, and the travel bookings. They requested interviews with Brian's employer and with the travel agent. Their investigation was not punitive in itself. It sought clarity about whether exploitation had occurred and whether protective steps were necessary. APS has a mandate to assess risk and to coordinate supports, and in my case, their involvement led to an official finding that there were concerns about financial exploitation. They issued a report recommending restitution consideration and supportive services. That report precipitated consequences that felt both public and private. Brian's employer, after being contacted by APS and conducting its own review of expense accounts related to his client interactions, placed him on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. It was not the place of a company to adjudicate family disputes, but when employees' conduct touches on ethical and financial responsibilities, workplaces are compelled to act. Within weeks, Brian was terminated. Tiffany's employer, a small design firm, received calls and emails about her posts and their provenance.
Public scrutiny has a way of radiating outward. Old friendships fray, colleagues distance themselves, and the social world a person inhabits alters transparently. I will not pretend those consequences delighted me. They did not feel like justice in some melodramatic sense. They felt like results following from a public accounting of choices. There was grief for the son I had known, and an acknowledgement of a rupture that might never heal. I wrote him a letter after the court hearing, simple, composed, and honest. I expressed sorrow over the path that had led us there, and affirmed boundaries. I did not demand reconciliation. I offered the possibility of accountability and the hope that someday he might make different choices. In the weeks after the hearing, the house settled back into its familiar creaks. The hydrangeas kept their color. People brought casseroles and cups of tea. The library organized a small panel on elder financial safety that grew into a larger community forum. People I had not known before came and listened and asked questions. The event had them bellies of laughter and a few quiet tears. Ordinary life, shaken and then rearranged into something like vigilance. The legal costs the court ordered against Brian and Tiffany did not fully cover the expenses, but Sarah worked with me to negotiate and manage the bills. She did not glorify the expenditure. She acknowledged the cost of safeguarding autonomy. That acknowledgement mattered. It made the choice to defend a life both pragmatic and principled, rather than merely reactive. From that moment on, a new project grew in my mind like an apple shoot through loam. The injustice I had experienced felt too concentrated to remain private. If a handwritten note in a petition could almost dismantle a life built over 37 years, then others might be at risk, unnamed and isolated. I thought of the small ways my neighbors had come forward, the quiet testimony of the library staff, and the way a small community had functioned as a shield. I wanted to make that shield wider. The idea of the foundation began as a phrase on a napkin at the library meeting. Porch light, someone offered, a name that suggested both the small domestic symbol of a welcoming home and the light one casts into dark corners. The name felt right, and the meeting spilled into the folio of practicalities. I convened a small steering committee. Helen, Clara, Patricia from the book club, David, and Sarah volunteered in advisory roles. We drafted a mission to provide information, community education, and navigation assistance for seniors at risk of financial exploitation. We would not offer legal advice. We would offer resources, referrals, and a local community network that could bear witness and provide documentation in troubling circumstances. Fundraising started modestly. The library offered meeting rooms without charge.
I made a short speech at our first fundraiser, a modest tea that seated 60 people, and tried to be both honest and encouraging. I spoke about the dignity of autonomy, about the need for neighbors who can recognize when a pattern looks like pressure and who know where to point a person for help. The donations were small checks and a few larger pledges from people who had been moved by the hearing. The first grant we received was from a local philanthropic fund interested in elders' rights. It funded an outreach coordinator and a small educational pamphlet about living trusts, power of attorney, and how to document financial transactions, always with the caveat that this information was educational, not prescriptive legal counsel. We held workshops at the senior center, practical, plain-speaking sessions where people could ask questions about documents, where a volunteer could help make a file of important papers, and where a neighbor could learn how to document interactions. We invited the county clerk to explain property records, and a retired bank officer came to discuss red flags for financial exploitation. Sarah and other lawyers volunteered time for group sessions, and we always prefaced their remarks by reminding everyone that each person's situation is unique and that lawyers should be consulted directly for case-specific legal advice. That careful line, education without prescription, was central to our ethos. We wanted to empower, not to promise. The foundation also developed a witness program, a coordinated network of neighbors and volunteers willing to provide contemporaneous documentation, dates, photos, a list of visitors, if an elder in their neighborhood reported concerns. Documentation had been my shield. We wanted to demystify it for others. The program included training on privacy, dignity, and how to avoid escalating confrontation. It was small and humane. People who would, in the words the group liked, be on the porch for one another. In the years that followed, the foundation grew in modest but meaningful ways. We partnered with the library to produce a small booklet on keeping your papers in order and a short video on recognizing signs of financial coercion. We ran an annual community open house that brought together social services, elder advocates, and legal aid providers. The work did what I had hoped it might. It transformed my private trial into a communal lesson. People who came to the workshops thanked me for speaking up. They said they felt emboldened to take simple steps, photocopying the trust, listing contacts, and checking account statements. My life, too, reshaped. The house, which had once felt threatened, became a place of renewal. I painted the back fence with a color Tom would have laughed at, bright, almost ridiculous. I planted more herbs in the kitchen box and replaced the sagging screen door with a sturdier one so the breeze could come in without rattling.
I began to host a porch light tea once a month, an informal gathering where neighbors could ask questions and where my book club read aloud selections that felt luminous about aging and agency. The garden party that would one day stand as an epilogue began in small iterations as these teas. Brian and Tiffany became part of the town's complicated shadow. They sent no apology that mattered. There were messages and emails, a few attempts at contact, some from a distance, some clumsy and unproductive. The severing was not cinematic. It was ordinary. The son I had known,
cheeky, tender, sometimes overwhelmed, was not wholly gone, but the person who had orchestrated the petition and the attempted removal of property had altered the contour of our relationship in a way I could not ignore. Grief and anger sat together in my chest for a time, like two neighbors who shared a wall. I did not seek revenge. I sought mediation once for a brief period to clarify boundaries and try to be honest about what I would accept in the future. The mediation collapsed into silence after a few sessions. Our lives had diverged along lines that conversation at that time could not bridge. I carried that loss like a folded letter, sometimes opened, sometimes left unread. There were quieter personal ripples as well. Some friends who had been casual drifted away under the pressure of the social awkwardness that accompanies family scandal. Others firmly and beautifully arrived. David became an unlikely companion, gentle, awkward in his charms, but present. We would sit on the back steps and drink tea and talk about trivial things, the best way to prune hydrangeas, whether it was too late to plant crocuses. Small, ordinary things anchored me. I began to date in a slow, careful way. Coffee with a man from the bridge club who liked crossword puzzles and gentle conversation. It was not a drama. It was life reknitted. The foundation reached a small milestone within 2 years. We held a symposium at the library, attended by representatives from the county clerk's office, the local bank's elder account manager, APS, and a handful of legal aid attorneys. The room was full. People lined the walls, handouts in hand. I gave a modest open speech, one that felt less like the center of attention and more like an invitation. None of us stands alone on a porch, I said. Sometimes the best boundary is a circle of people who see what we see and who will speak it plainly. At the symposium, we launched a pilot program, Porch Neighbors, that paired volunteers with elders who wanted a monthly check-in and a second set of eyes on bills and unexpected visitors. The program did not aim to impinge on privacy. It aimed to offer company and a witness. We hired an outreach coordinator and began to chart cases where simple documentation had prevented escalation.
We also developed a modest emergency fund to help with the legal costs for elders who could not afford counsel in the short term. This fund was never large, but it made a difference for at least 2 people in our first cohort. In public life, there was a kind of justice for Brian and Tiffany. Brian's termination led to difficulties securing work in his field. People call it consequence. It is not always a satisfying word, but it is the legal and social result of a pattern that becomes public. Tiffany faced the erosion of some professional relationships and a loss of social capital among the circles that valued transparency and professional probity. Their social media, once a runway of curated brilliance, became for many a record of overreach. I did not gloat. I watched from my porch as the ripple of accountability reached outward. The repercussions were tangible, but not vindictive. They were, I think, an inevitable outcome of choices made. One summer, 2 years after the hearing, we hosted a garden party to celebrate the Foundation's 3rd anniversary, and privately to mark a personal chapter of recovery. The garden was fuller than it had been in years. The apple tree finally bore a small enough crop for pies. We set tables beneath strings of lights. The book club read a short piece about small acts of courage. Sarah gave a quiet toast about law as a tool and about the importance of neighbors. Helen and Clara arranged a table of cucumber sandwiches with the precise care of people who have been friends for decades. People from the library, the bank, volunteers, and a scattering of strangers who had become friends gathered under the lights. I remember standing near the hedge with a cup of tea in my hand, watching the conversation drift around me, about wills and wills not fulfilled, about the color of a new paint job, about whether hydrangeas should be pruned in the autumn. The sound was domestic and ordinary, the thing I had fought to preserve. In my pocket was the letter I had once written to Brian. I had never sent it. I had folded it neatly and placed it among other papers in a small private drawer. That night, one of my neighbors, whom I will call Maria, because she asked for only a first name in the Foundation's newsletter, came up and pressed a folded note into my hand. "For the porch light," she said. It was a small check and a note, "Because the lights went out at my mother's house and you showed up with a lamp." I opened the note later and read the lines with a sense of something whole and generous. The work had not been merely about me. It had become a conduit by which other people's small crises could be met. I kept journaling through these years. My notes moved from the immediate, court dates, phone numbers, to reflections that were softer. Why grace matters,
what boundaries are made of, who we are when our children fail us.
I wrote about the paradox that protecting yourself sometimes means enlisting the help of others. It means turning the private into a public of witnesses without losing dignity. There were practical actions I learned and shared. I learned how to organize a file that made sense to a neighbor: the trust document, the deed, recent bank statements, a list of medications, emergency contacts. I learned to keep a simple log of visits and calls. I learned how to speak to a clerk at a bank without allowing the conversation to become accusatory. These were small skills, but they were the ones that had proven decisive in my case. I shared them not as prescriptions, but as stories of what had worked for me. When people ask if I am over it, I answer with the careful honesty of someone who knows grief is not a thing to be over, but a companion you learn to live with. I do not live now in a state of perpetual fear. I live in a state of vigilance. The distinction matters. Fear keeps you shrinking. Vigilance keeps you ready. Looking back, the sentence Brian said at the outset, "We used your savings for our honeymoon. You don't need that much anyway," functions like an axis. It remains painful, of course, because it crystallized something I had not expected. But it also became a pivot. That line forced me to examine what I had considered private and to assert publicly that a life's accumulation of years, of small acts of tenderness, of care, has moral and legal weight. People sometimes ask whether I felt guilty for taking my son to court, for using a legal system that can be blunt. I confess that there were nights of trembling at the thought of what the world would think, but I also knew that remaining silent would be complicit in a form of surrender. The decision to resist was for me an act of stewardship. I owed it to the memory of a lifetime with Tom and to the small lives that had been built in the rooms of this house to preserve what was mine to protect. The porch still creaks. The hydrangeas still blush from blue to purple in the summer sun. I still wash the dishes after supper and listen to the radio when it rained. My days contain books and meetings and laughter and the occasional quiet sorrow. The foundation, porch light, remains small but steady. We have learned lessons together: how to document, how to witness, how to hold accountable without becoming cruel. If there is one final thought I would leave you with, it is this: autonomy in later life is fragile in the face of close affection that becomes opportunistic. Protecting it requires both personal preparation and communal attention. Papers matter, yes, but so do neighbors. A community that looks in a direction is often the difference between a quiet exploitation and a public reckoning.
If this story resonates with you, if you see a neighbor or a friend in these pages, share this video and look in the description for resources, community hotlines, elder protection groups, and links to organizations that helped me and that offer guidance in non-legal terms. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories of people who stood up for themselves and for their neighbors. We do not become safer alone. We become safer together. Tonight, as dusk settles, I will put a kettle on and set 2 cups where at least one might be taken by a friend. The light on the porch casts a small circle on the steps. It is not a beacon of triumph so much as a promise to tend, to watch, and to offer witness. My son's sentence began this story. What has followed is the slow gathering of people who remember what a life looks like when it is honored. The house endures, the garden continues to grow, and the small lamp on the porch continues to be passed from hand to those who need it.